What if I told you that in one of the world's most surveilled cities, a 16-year-old girl could disappear without a trace, murdered by the very man trusted to protect her? What if I told you this happened in 2018 in broad daylight, in a place where cameras watch every corner? You're about to hear the story of Mera Valdez, a teenager who traveled thousands of miles for what she believed would be a better life, only to become trapped in a system designed to silence her voice forever. Have you ever felt completely powerless? Have you ever been in a situation where speaking up felt more dangerous than staying quiet? Have you ever wondered what you'd do if your entire future depended on someone who saw you as disposable? Because that's exactly where Mera found herself, in a luxury villa in Dubai's Jumeirah district, her passport locked away, her family thousands of miles away, her employer holding complete control over whether she could stay in the country or be deported at a moment's notice. But here's what makes this case absolutely devastating. Mera wasn't just failed by one predator. She was failed by an entire system that made her invisible, vulnerable, and ultimately expendable. This isn't just another true crime story about a bad person doing bad things. This is about how power structures can turn teenage girls into prey, how desperation can be weaponized, and how one girl's tragic death forced an entire nation to confront the dark reality hiding behind its glittering facade. Before we continue, and I need to be blunt here, if you care about justice, if you want to stay informed about cases that actually expose systemic problems, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Because honestly, the algorithm only pushes these important stories to people who prove they want to see them. And Mera's story? It deserves to be seen. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a teenage babysitter's murder exposed the deadly flaws in Dubai's domestic worker system. You'll learn how cutting-edge forensic technology caught a killer who thought his wealth and status made him untouchable. And you'll discover how Mera's death sparked legal reforms that are still protecting vulnerable workers today. But most importantly, you'll understand why this case matters far beyond one courtroom in Dubai, because the power dynamics that killed Mera Valdez are still operating in homes across the world right now. So buckle up. This story will shake you. It will anger you. And it should. Meet Adnan Kadir, 43 years old, Pakistani-British property developer, living the Dubai dream in 2017. Villa 27 in Jumeirah 3, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. A McLaren in the driveway. A successful dermatologist wife running her own clinic. The local tabloids even dubbed him the middle-class mogul for his portfolio of mid-market towers along the Dubai Canal. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The kind of success story Dubai loves to showcase. Immigrant entrepreneur makes it big in the land of opportunity. But success in Dubai often comes with a dirty little secret. Cheap domestic labor to maintain that luxury lifestyle. Enter Mera Valdez, 16 years old, from Iloilo in the Philippines. Brought to Dubai through a connection her aunt made. Her aunt worked as a catering steward on one of Adnan's yacht parties and mentioned her young niece needed work. Here's where things get immediately illegal. UAE law explicitly forbids hiring anyone under 18 as a domestic worker. Period. But Adnan didn't care about laws when they interfered with his convenience. The solution? Forged documents. A specialized fixer who dealt with overstayers provided fake papers listing Mera's age as 21. Just like that, a vulnerable teenager became legal on paper while remaining completely illegal in reality. Welcome to the kafala system. A sponsorship arrangement that sounds innocent but operates like modern slavery. Under this system, Adnan didn't just employ Mera. He owned her legal right to exist in the country. Her visa was tied directly to him. He controlled whether she could leave the villa. He controlled whether she kept her job. He controlled whether she stayed in Dubai or got deported. And most crucially, he controlled her passport. Despite more directives explicitly banning the practice, Adnan locked Mera's passport in his personal safe. She couldn't travel. She couldn't leave the country. She couldn't even prove her identity without his permission. This wasn't unusual. This was standard procedure for thousands of domestic workers across the UAE. Mera's bedroom was the children's playroom. She slept on a mattress between PlayStation cables and scattered toys. Her work schedule? 7 days a week. Her time off? 1 day per week, but only if Adnan felt like granting it. And even on her supposed rest day, she needed his explicit permission to leave the villa grounds. No privacy, no independence, no way to seek help if things went wrong. The isolation was calculated. Mera spoke minimal Arabic and limited English. She had no local friends, no support network, no understanding of her legal rights, assuming she had any. Her entire world was Villa 27 and the family that controlled her fate. This is what made her the perfect victim. Complete dependency creates complete vulnerability. Adnan's wife frequently traveled for medical conferences, leaving him alone with the domestic staff. The house staff included a Syrian chauffeur named Basil Haddad, but he lived in separate quarters and minded his own business. For 6 weeks, Mera performed her duties without incident. Wake up early, prepare breakfast for the family, take care of the children, clean the house, prepare dinner, clean up, go to sleep in the playroom. Rinse and repeat. She sent occasional messages to friends back home through WhatsApp, always positive, always grateful for the opportunity. Because what choice did she have? Complaining might get back to Adnan, and complaining meant deportation. But Adnan was watching, evaluating, planning. In the luxury villa with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, a 16-year-old girl was about to discover that being invisible to the outside world meant being completely exposed to the dangers within. Comment below if you've ever worked for someone who made you feel powerless, because Mera's isolation is more common than you think. The next 6 weeks would change everything. 6 weeks into her employment, everything changed for Mera Valdez. What started as a standard employer-employee relationship transformed into something far more dangerous. It began with gifts, an iPhone 7. For staying in touch with your family, Adnan explained, handing it to her one evening after dinner. Mera was grateful. Her old phone barely worked, and calling home to the Philippines was expensive. A small gold pendant appeared on her bedside table a week later. "You work so hard," he told her when she thanked him. "You deserve nice things." These weren't random acts of kindness. They were calculated investments. Each gift created debt. Each gift established a relationship beyond employer and employee. Each gift made Mera feel special and obligated. But the gifts came with conditions that weren't immediately obvious. Adnan started finding excuses to be alone with her. When his wife took the children shopping, he'd return from the office early. When the family went out for dinner, he'd suggest Mera stay home to rest, while he came back to check on things. The conversations started innocently. How was she adjusting to Dubai? Did she miss her family? Was there anything she needed? But gradually they became more personal, more invasive, more uncomfortable. "You're very mature for your age," he'd tell her. "More mature than most women I know." Mera later confided to her school friend back in Iloilo through encrypted WhatsApp messages that these interactions felt friendly, then confusing, then scary. She described how Adnan would stand too close when talking to her, how his hand would linger on her shoulder when he thanked her for something, how he'd find reasons to touch her arm during conversations. When she tried to maintain distance, the gifts stopped, and the threats began. "You know what happens to domestic workers who don't appreciate their positions?" he'd ask, his tone shifting completely. "They get sent home. No references. No final pay. Immigration authorities ask a lot of questions when someone's visa gets canceled suddenly." He'd remind her about other Filipino workers who'd been deported for causing problems. Stories about girls who'd been blacklisted from ever returning to the UAE. Tales of workers who'd been arrested at the airport and spent weeks in detention before being sent home empty-handed. "Your family is counting on the money you send home, aren't they?" he'd say. "Your mother's medical bills, your siblings' school fees. That all disappears if you can't work here anymore." The psychological pressure was relentless. Mera was trapped between gratitude for the job and growing fear of her employer. She needed the money. Her family depended on her salary. But staying meant accepting whatever Adnan demanded. In February 2018, his wife flew to Munich for a dermatology conference. She'd be gone for 10 days. That's when Adnan's behavior escalated from inappropriate to predatory. He started coming home from work earlier each day. He'd dismiss the other household staff early, leaving him alone with Mera. He'd suggest they watch movies together after the children went to bed. He'd offer her wine, knowing she couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful. "You're practically family now," he'd tell her. "We don't need to be so formal with each other." The physical boundary violations intensified. Unexpected hugs that lasted too long. His hand on her back when she served dinner. Comments about how pretty she looked in her uniform. Mera's WhatsApp messages to her friend during this period became increasingly desperate. She described feeling trapped but being unable to explain why. She wrote about wanting to quit but having nowhere to go. She mentioned being afraid but not knowing how to protect herself. "He makes me feel like I owe him everything," she wrote. "Like I should be grateful for whatever happens." The final message before the assault was heartbreaking. "I don't know what to do. If I complain, who would believe me? If I run, where would I go? If I fight back, what happens to my family? If this makes you angry, prove it by smashing that like button. Because your engagement is the only way YouTube will push this story to people who need to hear it." What happened next would destroy Mera's life and expose the deadly consequences of unchecked power over vulnerable workers. By February 2018, Mera Valdez was living her worst nightmare. But she didn't know yet that it was about to get infinitely worse. The assault had happened. Multiple times. In the playroom where she slept. In the kitchen while she prepared meals. In the living room while his family was out. Each incident followed by threats disguised as reminders about her precarious legal status. "Remember, you're here illegally," Adnan would whisper afterward. "Your papers say you're 21, but we both know that's not true. Immigration doesn't look kindly on document fraud." For weeks, Mera tried to pretend it wasn't happening. She threw herself into her work, caring for the children, cleaning obsessively, anything to avoid being alone with him. But in a house where your employer controls every aspect of your existence, there's nowhere to hide. The first sign was morning sickness. Mera initially dismissed it as stress. The constant fear, the disrupted sleep, the emotional trauma. Of course her body was rebelling. But when she fainted while feeding the youngest Kadir child, she couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. She was pregnant, 16 years old, thousands of miles from home, carrying the child of her rapist, in a country where her very existence was illegal. But here's what made Mera's situation absolutely hopeless. The UAE's legal system in 2018 criminalized consensual sex outside marriage. The Zina provisions meant that pregnancy outside wedlock wasn't just socially shameful. It was literally illegal, punishable by imprisonment and deportation. Mera wasn't just carrying an unwanted pregnancy. She was carrying evidence of a crime that she would be blamed for. Think about that for a moment. A teenage rape victim, pregnant by her abuser, facing potential arrest for the crime of being sexually assaulted. This is the legal framework that protected predators and punished victims. One morning, the inevitable happened. Mera collapsed in the kitchen, unconscious. When she came to, Adnan was standing over her, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "We're going to the doctor," he announced. "You're going to tell them you fell down the stairs." The private clinic on Al Wazl Road confirmed what Mera already suspected. 12 weeks pregnant. But here's where the UAE's reporting laws created another trap. The doctor, bound by mandatory reporting requirements at the time, was supposed to inform authorities about unmarried pregnant patients. Instead, he made a different choice, one that would seal Mera's fate. He informed Adnan privately, giving him 3 days to return with either a marriage certificate or official guardianship documentation. No authorities contacted. No social services involved. No protection for the victim. Just a businessman given 3 days to handle his problem. Adnan's solution? Eliminate the evidence. He drove Mera to Sharjah to meet a Bangladeshi pharmacist who operated on the margins of legality. Black market misoprostol pills, abortion medication sold without proper medical supervision or follow-up care. "This will solve everything," Adnan told her during the drive. No one needs to know anything happened. You take these pills, you recover, we move on. Your family keeps getting their money. I need to pause here and ask, are you actually subscribed? Because if you're watching this for free without subscribing, you're basically saying these victim stories don't matter enough for a simple click. Mera took the pills. She had no choice. Refusing meant deportation, arrest, or worse. She followed the pharmacist's instructions, hoping the nightmare would end. But the medication failed. Instead of ending the pregnancy safely, the pills triggered massive hemorrhaging. 2 nights later, in the children's playroom that served as her bedroom, Mera began bleeding uncontrollably. Adnan found her collapsed on the floor, blood soaking through her clothes and pooling on the tile beneath her. His first instinct wasn't to call an ambulance. It wasn't to seek proper medical care. It wasn't to save the life of the teenager who worked for him. His first instinct was to protect himself. The pregnancy that was supposed to disappear had become a medical emergency. The victim who was supposed to suffer in silence was dying loudly. The problem he thought he'd solved was about to expose everything. What happened next would determine whether Mera Valdez lived to see her 17th birthday. March 1, 2018. 11:47 p.m. Mera Valdez was dying in the children's playroom of Villa 27, and Adnan Kadir knew it. The hemorrhaging had been going on for hours. Blood soaked through towel after towel. Mera drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin growing paler with each passing minute. The botched abortion had triggered complications that required immediate emergency medical intervention. But calling an ambulance meant questions. Questions meant investigations. Investigations meant the end of everything Adnan had built. So instead of saving her life, he made frantic phone calls to save his reputation. His first call went to a contact from the Filipino Domestic Worker Network, someone who claimed to know traditional healers who handled women's problems discreetly. No hospitals, no official records, no legal complications. The woman on the phone gave him 3 numbers. Underground practitioners who advertised in private Facebook groups, promising solutions for delicate situations. The first healer refused to come. Too much blood loss. Too dangerous. The second wanted payment upfront and guarantees about police involvement. When Adnan couldn't provide those guarantees, the line went dead. The third never answered. By 1:30 a.m., Mera was barely responsive. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse was weak. She needed professional medical care immediately, but Adnan had already decided that her life was worth less than his freedom. He called his chauffeur, Basil Haddad. "I need your help," Adnan told him over the phone. "There's been an accident. We need to move someone." Basil arrived at Villa 27 20 minutes later to find his employer standing over an unconscious teenage girl covered in blood. "She took some medication," Adnan explained. "It went wrong. If we call the hospital, there will be questions. Immigration will get involved. We'll all be in trouble." What Basil didn't know was that he was looking at a murder in progress. Adnan had already made his decision. Mera Valdez couldn't be allowed to survive and tell her story. She couldn't be allowed to testify about what he'd done to her. She couldn't be allowed to live as walking evidence of his crimes. At 2:17 a.m., Dubai's extensive camera network captured Adnan's Range Rover leaving Jumeirah 3. License plate clearly visible. 2 occupants in the front seats. Something large wrapped in blankets in the back. The destination was Al Qudra Road, a stretch of desert about 40 kilometers from the city center. It's a popular spot for cycling and hiking during the day, but completely deserted at night. Perfect for disposing of problems. Phone records would later reveal that during the drive, Adnan made additional calls to Filipino Facebook contacts, still desperately seeking someone who could fix the situation. But by this point, fixing meant something very different than healing. At 2:20 a.m., toll cameras showed the Range Rover taking the exit toward the cycling track area. The desert road stretched empty in both directions. What happened in those dark minutes would be reconstructed later through forensic evidence, digital analysis, and Basil's eventual confession. Mera was still alive when they reached the desert. Weak, barely conscious, but breathing. Adnan couldn't risk her recovering. Couldn't risk her talking. Couldn't risk her identifying him as her rapist and the father of her unborn child. Forensic examiners would later find petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, tiny blood spots that indicate oxygen deprivation, bruising around her neck consistent with ligature compression. Classic signs of strangulation. Adnan Kadir murdered Mera Valdez with his own hands in the middle of the desert, while his unborn child died with her. At 4:06 a.m., cameras captured the Range Rover returning to city limits. Only one passenger now. Basil's silver Nissan Tiida followed 8 minutes later, completing the disposal operation. They left her body 50 meters from the road, still wearing her navy blue babysitter uniform. A disposable surgical mask had been pulled beneath her chin, probably used to muffle her final sounds. Sunrise hikers found her 6 hours later. Mera Valdez was 16 years old. She was 14 weeks pregnant. She died thousands of miles from her family, killed by the man who was supposed to protect her. Share this video. I'm serious. Mera can't speak for herself anymore, so we have to amplify her story. Don't just watch and scroll away. But here's what Adnan didn't count on. Dubai's reputation for cutting-edge forensic investigation wasn't just marketing hype. The technology that makes the city a surveillance state also makes it nearly impossible to commit the perfect crime. The evidence trail he left behind would unravel his carefully constructed lies and expose him as exactly what he was, a predator who thought his wealth and status made him untouchable. Within 24 hours of Mera's body being discovered, Dubai police had launched one of the most technologically sophisticated murder investigations in UAE history. What Adnan didn't realize was that his attempt to dispose of evidence in the desert had actually created a digital trail that would destroy his defense. The initial news coverage was minimal. The National ran a small brief. Body of female found near Al-Qudra. Police appeal for information. To the public, this looked like another routine case. But behind the scenes, investigators were already deploying resources that would make CSI teams jealous. Dubai's Oyun smart camera network had recently expanded across the emirate. Over 35,000 cameras connected to a central AI system that could track vehicles, analyze movement patterns, and cross-reference data in real time. What took detectives weeks to accomplish manually could now be done in hours. Within 6 hours, analysts had pulled license plate snapshots from multiple angles showing Adnan's Range Rover traveling toward Al-Qudra at 2:17 a.m. The same vehicle returning at 4:06 a.m. Basil's Nissan Tiida following the same route 8 minutes later. But the real breakthrough came from the victim herself. Mera's iPhone, the gift Adnan had given her to establish trust, was found cracked but functional near her body. The screen was shattered, but the digital forensics team managed to extract crucial evidence. A partial fingerprint on the broken screen. Clear enough for comparison. Recent enough to matter. When investigators ran the print through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, they initially got no matches. Adnan had no criminal record. But Dubai police had implemented a new protocol requiring all visa holders to provide biometric data during registration. The thumbprint on Mera's phone screen matched Adnan Kadir with 100% certainty. This wasn't just evidence that he'd handled her phone. The placement and pressure patterns indicated he'd tried to unlock it after she was unconscious. He'd been looking for evidence. Messages, photos, anything that might implicate him. But here's what he didn't know. WhatsApp's encryption meant her messages to friends in the Philippines were stored on servers he couldn't access. Even deleting the app wouldn't eliminate the digital trail. The forensics team also discovered something else on her phone. Location data. GPS coordinates showing every place the device had traveled in the weeks before her death. The data confirmed she'd rarely left Villa 27 except for trips to the clinic and that final journey to Sharjah for the illegal abortion pills. Toll road cameras provided additional confirmation. Electronic payment records showed Adnan's registered vehicle passing through specific checkpoints at exact times that matched the phone's location data. The investigation team also deployed gait analysis technology, software that can identify individuals based on their walking patterns. CCTV footage from the villa's vicinity was processed through algorithms that compared movement characteristics with reference footage of Adnan and Basil. The matches were undeniable. But the most damning evidence came from cellular tower data. Both men's phones had ping towers along the route to Al-Qudra at the exact times the cameras captured their vehicles traveling in that direction. On March 3rd, just 48 hours after the body was discovered, Dubai police arrested both Adnan Qadir and Basil Haddad. The speed of the arrests shocked the expatriate community. This wasn't the usual months-long investigation. This was precision law enforcement using every technological advantage available. Basil broke during his first interrogation. He said we had to move her, Basil told investigators. He kept talking about protecting his family name and keeping his wife's clinic safe. I thought we were taking her to a hospital. When we got to the desert, she wasn't moving anymore. But Basil's version had holes. His claim that Mera was already dead when they reached Al-Qudra contradicted the forensic evidence. The strangulation marks were post-mortem from the hemorrhaging. Someone had killed her in the desert. Quick question, why haven't you subscribed yet? These investigations cost taxpayers millions, but you can't invest a free subscription in learning about them? Adnan's interrogation took a different approach. He denied any sexual relationship with Mera. He claimed Basil had assaulted her and was framing him to avoid responsibility. But the forensic evidence told a different story. DNA samples taken from under Mera's fingernails matched Adnan with 99.98% probability. The same DNA matched the fetal tissue, confirming paternity beyond any reasonable doubt. Basil's DNA was nowhere to be found on the victim. The investigation that had started with a body in the desert had become an ironclad case of premeditated murder, sexual assault, and conspiracy. Technology had given Mera Valdez a voice even after death. Now it was time for justice. Dubai Criminal Court, December 2018. The trial of Adnan Qadir would become a landmark case. Not just for the brutality of the crime, but for how it exposed the intersection between UAE morality laws and violent crime. Prosecutor Sarah Al-Mansouri faced a complex challenge. She had overwhelming forensic evidence for murder, but the case also involved charges that made some observers uncomfortable. Consensual sex outside marriage, human trafficking violations for employing an underage worker, and abortion-related offenses. The defense strategy was predictable but desperate. Adnan's legal team, led by prominent criminal attorney James Morrison, attempted to shift blame entirely onto Basil while portraying their client as a victim of extortion. My client is a respected businessman who has been framed by his employee, Morrison argued during opening statements. The real perpetrator is attempting to destroy an innocent man's reputation to save himself. But the evidence presentation destroyed that narrative piece by piece. The prosecution began with the digital forensics. Court observers watched in silence as analysts presented CCTV composites showing both vehicles traveling to and from the desert. The timestamps were precise. The license plates were clear. The route was undeniable. Next came the cellular data. Phone records showing both defendants' devices pinging towers along the Al-Qudra route at the exact times the cameras captured their vehicles. Then the DNA evidence. Dr. Amina Hassan, the forensic DNA specialist, took the stand to explain the genetic profiles found under Mera's fingernails. The courtroom fell silent as she confirmed that the samples matched Adnan Qadir with a probability exceeding 99.98%. These are not trace amounts, Dr. Hassan testified. The volume and placement of genetic material indicates direct physical contact during a struggle. The fetal DNA evidence was equally damning. The unborn child's genetic profile confirmed Adnan as the biological father with identical certainty. Morrison attempted to challenge the timeline, bringing in a private obstetrician to argue that fetal development could support Basil's paternity instead. But the medical testimony backfired when the prosecution's expert witnesses used ultrasound measurements to confirm conception had occurred during a period when only Adnan had access to the victim. The WhatsApp messages were read aloud in court. Mera's desperate communications to her friend in the Philippines painted a clear picture of escalating abuse and fear. He makes me feel like I should be grateful for whatever happens. The prosecutor read from one message. I don't know what to do. If I complain, who would believe me? These weren't the words of a willing participant. These were the words of a terrified teenager trapped by someone who held absolute power over her existence. Basil's confession was presented next. His detailed statement about Adnan's references to protecting the family name and keeping the clinic safe established motive alongside the physical evidence. The defense made one final desperate attempt, arguing that publicity around the zina charges had tainted public opinion and made a fair trial impossible. Judge Abdullah al-Rashid addressed this directly. The court evaluates evidence based on forensic facts, not public sentiment. The genetic evidence, digital forensics, and witness testimony create an overwhelming case for premeditated murder. But the courtroom tension wasn't just about the murder charges. The case highlighted uncomfortable realities about how UAE morality laws interacted with violent crimes against vulnerable workers. Legal observers noted that the zina provisions meant Mera faced potential prosecution for being raped. Even in death, she was technically guilty of a crime under laws that existed in 2018. This created a moral paradox. A murder victim who was also, legally speaking, a criminal under the very system seeking justice for her death. On December 15, 2018, the three-judge panel delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Adnan Kadir was sentenced to 25 years in prison for premeditated murder, the harshest sentence short of execution that Dubai courts had handed down in a domestic worker homicide case since 2012. The adultery charge added 1 additional year to his sentence. Basil Haddad received 5 years for accessory to murder and assisting with body disposal. Tell me in the comments, do you think 25 years was enough? Because the death penalty was on the table here. The sentences marked the end of the legal proceedings, but the beginning of something much larger. A reckoning with the systems that had made Mera's murder possible in the first place. Mera Valdez's murder sent shockwaves far beyond courtroom 5C. Her death became a catalyst for systemic changes that are still protecting vulnerable workers today. The Philippine Consulate General, accustomed to handling wage theft and contract violations, suddenly found themselves managing their highest-profile murder case in recent memory. Consul General Edgar Badajos used the international attention to lobby for immediate reforms. Mera died because she had no way to seek help, Badajos stated during a press conference. Her passport was locked away. She couldn't leave the country. She couldn't even prove her identity. This cannot continue. Within 6 months, the Philippine government had negotiated new protocols requiring all UAE employers to register domestic workers' passport numbers with the consulate. The Passport Retrieval Protocol allowed consular officers to demand immediate access to travel documents during welfare visits. More importantly, it established a 24-hour emergency hotline specifically for domestic workers facing abuse. The number was distributed through Filipino community networks and social media groups across the UAE. But the changes weren't limited to diplomatic pressure. Human Rights Watch seized on the case for their 2019 report on domestic worker protections in the Gulf. The organization cited Mera's death as evidence that legal reforms weren't enough without enforcement mechanisms. Even when the letter of the law promises protection, the power imbalance of the kafala framework remains lethal, the report stated. Mera Valdez died not because there were no laws protecting her, but because those laws were impossible to access when she needed them most. The report triggered additional scrutiny from international labor organizations and women's rights groups. The UAE faced mounting pressure to demonstrate that Mera's death had triggered meaningful reform, not just symbolic gestures. Dubai police responded by implementing the Domestic Safety File platform, a digital registry requiring all villa owners who employ domestic staff to register workers' Emirates ID numbers with authorities. The system allows social services officers to conduct unannounced wellness visits. Workers can be interviewed privately. Living conditions can be inspected. Most crucially, passport confiscation can be detected and prosecuted immediately. The platform launched in January 2019 and has already resulted in over 200 investigations into employer violations. 12 employers have faced criminal charges for document confiscation. 43 workers have been relocated to safer employment situations. But the most significant change came from an unexpected direction: the UAE's own legal evolution. In November 2020, The country implemented sweeping legal reforms that decriminalized consensual sex between unmarried adults. The Xena provisions that had made Mera's pregnancy a criminal matter were eliminated entirely. Under the amended penal code, unmarried pregnant women now simply register their newborns and obtain identity documents. No prosecution, no deportation, no criminalization of rape victims. Legal scholars directly credit cases like Mera's for accelerating these reforms. Her predicament, fearing jail if her pregnancy were discovered, is exactly what lawmakers sought to prevent, explained Dr. Hassan El-Nabhan, a constitutional law professor at UAE University. When a rape victim faces prosecution for being assaulted, the legal system has failed fundamentally. The timing wasn't coincidental. Legislators had reviewed multiple cases where domestic workers faced impossible legal situations. Mera's story became the most compelling argument for change. If you're still not subscribed after hearing how one girl's death changed an entire legal system, I honestly don't know what will convince you. Today, pregnant domestic workers can seek medical care without fearing arrest. They can report sexual assault without being charged as co-conspirators. They can access prenatal care and social services previously denied to them. These changes came too late for Mera Valdez, but they exist because her death forced an uncomfortable confrontation with systematic injustice. Her murder exposed flaws that policymakers could no longer ignore. Her case became the evidence that transformed legal frameworks across an entire nation. The question now is whether these reforms are sufficient, or if more fundamental changes to the kafala system are still needed. 5 years later, Villa 27 in Jumeirah 3 remains empty. The iron gates are chained shut. The McLaren is gone from the driveway. A for sale sign has been posted and removed multiple times, but no buyer wants the property where a teenage girl was murdered. Neighbors remember the day police tapes surrounded the compound. Some hired new domestic workers within weeks, convinced that better vetting would prevent similar tragedies. Others installed additional CCTV systems, believing constant surveillance equals safety. But among Dubai's estimated 750,000 domestic workers, Mera's story circulates in WhatsApp groups as something different, a warning about the dangers that no amount of cameras can prevent. The kafala system still exists, despite the legal reforms. Employers still sponsor their workers' visas. Workers still depend on their employers for legal status. The fundamental power imbalance that enabled Adnan's crimes remains largely intact. Passport confiscation is now illegal and actively prosecuted. But enforcement depends on workers knowing their rights and feeling safe enough to report violations. For many domestic workers, isolated in private homes, speaking limited Arabic, financially desperate, that safety still doesn't exist. The WhatsApp messages that travel through worker networks tell a familiar story. Employers who forget to pay salaries for months. Workers who aren't allowed phone access. Teenagers whose documents list false ages. Women who work 7 days a week without breaks. Not every employer is a murderer like Adnan Kadir, but every domestic worker operates within a system that makes them vulnerable to whoever controls their visa. If you're learning about these ongoing issues for the first time and you're not subscribed to stay informed about cases that matter, then you're part of the problem. Subscribe now if you actually care about vulnerable workers getting justice. Labor rights activists point to ongoing problems that Mera's death didn't solve. Workers who want to change employers still need their current sponsors' permission. Reporting abuse can still result in visa cancellation and deportation. Economic desperation still forces workers to accept dangerous situations. The legal reforms help, but they don't change the basic reality, explains Maria Santos, who runs a support network for Filipino domestic workers in Dubai. These women are still isolated in private homes with people who have enormous power over their lives. Mera's case shows what happens when that power is abused. The domestic safety file system has helped some workers escape dangerous situations. The 24-hour emergency hotline has fielded thousands of calls. The legal changes have eliminated some of the most obvious injustices, but structural vulnerability remains. Recent estimates suggest there are over 2 million domestic workers across the Gulf states, most operating under similar sponsorship arrangements. The majority work in safe, respectful environments. But for those who don't, the barriers to seeking help haven't disappeared. Mera's death forced UAE lawmakers to confront the legal framework that criminalized rape victims. It prompted diplomatic pressure that improved some protections. It sparked investigations that caught her killer. But it didn't eliminate the isolation that made her vulnerable in the first place. Hit that notification bell, because stories like these don't trend naturally. They need people like you to demand them. In worker dormitories from Al-Quoz to Satwa, in cramped bedrooms and servant quarters across the Emirates, domestic workers still share Mera Valdez's story late at night when their employers are sleeping. They share it not as entertainment, but as education. A reminder about power, vulnerability, and the thin line between protection and control. Her name appears in Gulf News archives only as initials, another footnote in a city obsessed with progress. But for the women whose lives mirror hers, Mera Valdez remains unforgotten. Mera Valdez was supposed to turn 17 in April 2018. Instead, she died alone in the desert, murdered by the man who promised her family a better future. Her story could have ended there. Another anonymous tragedy in a city that prefers success stories to uncomfortable truths. Another domestic worker who disappeared without making headlines. But Mera's death refused to stay buried in the sand. Her murder exposed a system that turned teenage girls into prey. It revealed how desperation could be weaponized by predators who understood that isolation equals vulnerability. Proof that even the most powerless victims can spark change that outlasts their killers. Adnan Kadir sits in Dubai Central Prison, serving 25 years for destroying a life that was worth infinitely more than his freedom. Basil Haddad was released after 5 years, deported back to Syria. Mera Valdez never made it home to the Philippines. But her story traveled further than she ever could. In the glittering towers and luxury villas of modern Dubai, behind the carefully curated image of progress and prosperity, vulnerable workers still face dangers that no amount of wealth can justify. The question isn't whether another Mera Valdez will face similar circumstances. The question is whether we'll pay attention when it happens. Mera Valdez died alone in a desert, but her story doesn't have to die with her. If this video taught you something, if it made you think, if it opened your eyes, then prove it. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and ring that notification bell. Because the only way we honor victims like Mera is by refusing to let their stories be forgotten. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.